One of the problems with science communication, I think, from the scientist's perspective, is that we tend to throw facts at people, and we're quite convinced by facts. We tend to be evidence-based. But many people don't make decisions in that way. And so when talking to the general public, you need to have a different approach than just lecturing them with facts. And it's really trying to connect with shared values and how the work that we're doing as scientists is contributing towards the shared values of the public. And that really is a bit of a different face to what scientists usually put forward, and maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable position to be in, where you're actually empathizing and sharing yourself a little bit more than you do perhaps in a scientific meeting. What I try to do is humanize it a little bit and ask, well, where are you getting that information from? And also in terms of, I have kids myself, and I'm interested in their safety and well-being, and so connecting there with particularly mums if they're concerned about the safety of their kids. Obviously even scientists care about their own children, shocking as that may be, and sometimes we even fail to make that obvious point. My interest in discussions with the public is discussing production systems and the trade-offs associated with different things that are being suggested for the production systems. And I think often the trade-offs are not well elaborated when people want to get rid of this technology or prohibit this production system. And it's like, well, okay, but be aware of the environmental implications of what you're suggesting, or the animal welfare implications, or the sustainability implications. And I think that kind of more nuanced discussion is where the values that we share are really important, because I think most people want safe, affordable food with a low environmental footprint, and that really, getting to that nirvana is tricky, and it requires a really good thought process in terms of what are the trade-offs of different systems. Sometimes you see scientists portrayed as very cold and maybe not caring, and there has been a history of suggesting that somehow they're all paid off by industry. And I mean, I think that perception came around with good basis. I mean, there were scientists that, for example, said smoking was safe, that were being paid by the smoking companies or the cigarette companies or tobacco companies. And I think that narrative has tended to carry through to just be a general smear that's used against all scientists. And I just reject that. I just think, I know too many scientists, especially at the land grants of public universities, whose interests are trying to improve the sustainability of our food production system. And I just think that the probability of that many thousands of scientists all being paid off by industry, I mean, we can't get agreement at a faculty meeting as to whether the sky is blue, let alone getting the global scientific community to agree on something. In my opinion, if there's scientific societies like the National Academy of Science that have looked at topics, be it global warming or vaccine safety or GMOs, and their documents say that that particular technology is safe or that this is happening, then I'm going to go to that as a trusted source of scientific information. I'm not going to go with the one-off scientist that's saying something totally different to all of the scientific societies of the world. And I think often when you see, bad scientists, there are these one-off scientists that are coming out with a really outlying study that doesn't seem to fit with the mainstream of what many hundreds or thousands of other scientists are finding out. And so I think there are rogue scientists or ideologues that are putting out information, but have a look at the weight of evidence around a topic. And that really is where I think, that's the best of our scientific knowledge. And that's where the scientific societies and the National Academy of Science, those types of groups really come in, because there you've got a group of scientists that have come together, and if there is one with an ideology, they have to have facts to back it up before it'll get in a report, and that kind of keeps everyone honest, I think. The discussion around grass-fed versus corn-fed beef, I think, is a really interesting one. I was raised in Australia, which of course is a grass finishing system because we don't have a corn belt. And so I think some of it is taste preference. And certainly, you know, in America, the real kind of competitive advantage is the fact that there is the corn belt, and there are trade-offs associated with grass finishing versus corn finishing. And so again, it's more nuanced than one's good, one's bad. I think it's a choice. They taste different. And in fact, if you look at the overall carbon emissions as a result of corn finishing animals, they get to market weight in less time as compared to grass finishing animals, which has its own set of environmental benefits in terms of CO2 produced per kilogram or pound of beef. And so, you know, some environments, New Zealand, for example, the coastal regions of California, make sense to grass feed because you have pasture all year round. Usually when we're talking GMOs in the general public, we're talking about genetically engineered organisms. And it is a very politicized topic. And unfortunately, there's been so much fear-mongering and misinformation out there that the public the percentage of the public that think it's safe is about 30% versus the scientific community is about 90%. So there's almost, I think it's a 55-point gap between where the science is on this topic and what the general public think about it. And it's like, how did that happen? You know, how did people just wake up one day and say this breeding method is unsafe? And I think if you look at the history, there's been this targeted misinformation campaign suggesting there are health impacts associated with this particular breeding method. And there's 20 years of studies, and literally every scientific society in the world has said there are no unique risks associated with this breeding method. And unfortunately, those are facts and they don't sell, and fear sells and science doesn't. And so trying to have the discussion with the public around this is a really hard thing because they've heard, oh my gosh, it might give me cancer, or my kid's autism, or give me AIDS, or all these crazy stories. And once you've set that fear in someone's mind, it's hard to reassure them that in fact the data don't show that. There has been a draconian decrease in the use of insecticides globally as a result of Bt or Bacillus thuringiensis protected crops. And insecticides are a really nasty group of pesticides to use for farmers and for the environment. And so the environmental benefit of that particular application is huge. Disease-resistant plants like the papaya in Hawaii that's resistant to ring spot, the banana in Uganda that's resistant to the bacterial wilt disease, that doesn't use any chemicals at all. It just protects the crops from disease. That fits with everybody's definition of sustainability. And so I think that, you know, the problems that are trying to be addressed, insects eating your crop or diseases destroying your crop, using this breeding method have to be discussed and say, well, if we don't use Bt, for example, then farmers have been using very toxic insecticides. But I think, you know, generally sustainability refers to some type of an intersection between the different components of food production, the economic components, be it price for the consumer or the producer's economic viability, environment, so what are the environmental footprints of that particular production system, and then social, which is this kind of all-encompassing term that includes things like farm worker wages and animal welfare and consumer acceptability. And somewhere in the middle of this kind of intersecting group of circles, there's this white nirvana that's known as sustainable, without a real acknowledgement of the fact that those three pillars kind of fight against each other to some extent. And so there's what's called trade-offs or pools between them. And so what might be the most optimal system in terms of animal welfare, for example, might not be economically viable for the farmer or might not be affordable for the consumer, and might be really bad from the environmental perspective in terms of actual production of, you know, milk meat or eggs per hectare or acre. Those types of trade-offs I think are really important, and sometimes I've seen companies will make an arbitrary decision around an animal care suggestion because of their interest in sustainability, without acknowledging that, yeah, we're working towards this particular component of sustainability, but we've just gone absolutely backwards in terms of the economics and the environmental impact of our production system by putting 100% emphasis on perhaps the animal welfare component. And I think there has to be an honest discussion around those trade-offs, because if you only look at one component of sustainability, you're really not necessarily embracing a sustainable system. Historically, mandatory labelling in the US has been constrained to material differences in the product itself. In other words, if, I don't know, a bagel contains peanuts, you have to label it because people might have an allergen to peanuts. So that's a material difference that you need to label. And then the voluntary labelling has been reserved for niche markets that maybe want a particular grass-fed beef or cage-free eggs. And that's a kind of a small section of the community, and it gets that label, and there's a price differential associated with that, and people can select that in the marketplace. And that's fine, but I think what I've seen recently is a real proliferation of absence labeling, selling food based on what's not in it, doesn't contain gluten or doesn't contain GMOs or no additives or this type of thing. And I think we're in a funny situation in the world where we're defined by what's not in our food. I mean, well, especially in the case of gluten-free bananas, there wasn't any gluten there in the first place. Or, in the case of chickens, you'll often see, hormone-free chicken. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure there's hormones in there from the chicken itself. But if you're talking added hormones, that's not allowed in chicken production systems anyway. And so it's advertising something that's not in the competitors' products as well, and acting as if somehow by putting that there, it kind of casts aspersions on the products that don't have that on there. Most consumers don't have time to sit down and look at the nuances of different agricultural production systems. They just want to know that the food they're buying is safe for their family and tastes good. And I think that's kind of what happens is the marketers can get in a quick soundbite, suggest that their product is better or doesn't contain this or that or the other. And the counter to that is quite a lengthy explanation because of all the trade-offs and nuances of production systems. And I guess as extension educators, the one message that I think is really important is to discuss the trade-offs with people and to understand a little bit the background. So even 1 or 2 slides on what the implications of a particular purchase are when you're only looking at one component of sustainability is really important. And people will often say, oh yeah, I like this particular label because it makes me feel good, and then you're like, well, did you know that if you do that, this is associated with a deleterious impact on animal welfare or a much bigger environmental footprint? Then often they'll realign, well, actually my values are that that's not what I intended by that purchase. I didn't know that. And they will realign their purchases based on that. And so just a little bit of information can alter someone's choices. And unfortunately, it's that discussion of trade-offs that's often absent in the press and also in the marketing. Where I draw the line is when groups that want a particular production system then impose their choice on everybody else. And that's when you start having the inequities occurring where a well-heeled group is imposing their choices on conventional food production systems, and that has impact particularly on the poor. So anything you do to increase food prices has a disproportionately big impact on poor people. And so if you suddenly mandatorily require that all chickens be raised in free-range conditions or something like that, where you basically are increasing the price of eggs, as what happened in California, that has disproportionately big impact on poor people. And that's where I think it becomes a little bit socially unjust when you've got, you know, a small group imposing on the rest of society their particular viewpoint of how agriculture should run. And why not let there be different markets to accommodate that particular interest? What isn't well understood is the important role that breeding has on the overall sustainability or environmental footprint of our food production systems. And so if we look at the gains in productivity, for example, that have occurred in corn and soy over the last 50 or so years, as a result of all sorts of breeding innovations, you know, hybrids and different varieties that have been improved, if it hadn't been for that improvement, the amount of land we'd need, for example, to grow the corn crop that we grew in 2014, we would need to plant, in addition to the land under corn now, we'd also need to plant the entire state of California and Texas under corn to get the same yield that we did in 2014 as a result of adopting these improved varieties. And so if we'd stuck at the 1950s varieties and their production, we would need those two additional states planted under corn. And I think that just gives you a visual representation of, if it wasn't for the genetic improvement, we would need to plant a lot more land under agriculture in order to obtain the amount of food that we produced, you know, now. And so the environmental impact of that improvement is really dramatic in terms of we're basically producing more food per hectare or acre, and you can see that in the corn yields or the soy yields or the dairy cattle production, and that reduces the overall global footprint of a bushel of corn or a glass of milk. There is a role for science here to try to say what is the optimum system, but the trade-offs are a little bit personal. So, you know, you might think it's better to be in a cage than be cannibalized, whereas I might say it's more important to be free range, and if you get cannibalized, you know, you've got the benefit of having been free range, and it becomes down to a little bit of a judgment call, which science can't do. Personal judgment calls, there's no way to objectively quantify that, and I think that's where the rub is in terms of what is the most appropriate production system. And to me, that's where I like to have the options in the marketplace to purchase what agrees with my personal value system. And I don't like when groups impose their value system on the entire consumer base and say this is the only way that the animals can be raised.